So you are welcome to another session of HIS LAG HIS 203 Global History of Slavery, where we've been discussing the transnational dimension to to slavery historically. Particularly in this course, we are much more interested to the history of slavery right from the inception, from the earliest times, particularly up to the era of the transatlantic slave trade. I think, yeah, we'll also look at contemporary slavery, probably in one of the last classes. All right, probably that's when I return. So we are focusing basically on the ways in which the transatlantic slave trade reconfigured the politics in Africa during from 15th century to the 19th century. If may I ask, can you see my video? Am I showing on the video there?
Yes, we can see your slide, John.
What about my face? No? Hello? Okay, you can see only my slide you can see.
I can see your face, sir.
All right, thank you. Okay, so last week we examined Africa before the transatlantic slave trade. And one of the key things we discovered last week in our discussion is that all the sections of the economy, of the socio-political life or history of Africa were very productive and generated their own growth and development in different dimensions. So there wasn't any society that was primitive, that was uncivilized or barbaric in Africa before the 15th century that would justify the introduction of a pernicious trade in human trafficking, which the Europeans inaugurated in the 15th century. And you have seen from the discussions that we had last week how political institutions existed in one part of Africa, West Africa to the other, how social institutions thrive and engendered inclusive and sustainable development. And I think I cited the argument of the eminent scholar Claude Ake, who observed that societies in Africa were invariably, though patrimonial and communal. He noted that everything was everybody's business, engendering a strong emphasis on participation, noting that how standard of accountability were even greater and stricter in pre-colonial Africa than in Western societies. Chiefs were answerable not only for their own actions, but for natural catastrophes such as famine, such as epidemics, floods, droughts, right, that affected their society. Even though we noted that some forms of slavery, all right, in this case, pawning was much more preponderant. Pawning of people as collateral for credit did exist in Africa, but this is considerably distinct from the transatlantic slave trade, which was inaugurated from the 15th century. For instance, under pawning, if a man realized that he could probably not subsist, he could pawn himself for a certain sum of money, or his friend, or his siblings, or his children, or his friends to do some work for him. So these were kind of domestic, kind of servitude, all right, which is quite different from what Africa recorded for over 400 years. So in this case, pawning involved people maintaining cordial relationship, all right, through a principle of mutually allowed reciprocity. All right, you borrow me some money, I cannot pay you cash. I come and offer my labor, my service, or ask one of my relatives to offer such services in payment of these financial obligations. And this was the situation in Africa when the slave trade was inaugurated. So the transatlantic slave trade, as we mentioned, started in the 15th century and 16th century when the Spanish and the Portuguese interests shifted from the fabled deposits of agricultural commodities, which was initially exchanged with the people of West Africa, all right, particularly, all right, with the contact with the voyage of exploration. All right, but this soon shifted, all right, as the Portuguese and the Spanish interests shifted into more readily and needed resources, all right, for productive activities in America. Don't forget, we noted how the vast land in America, all right, was expropriated by the Europeans on their arrival, right? And looking at these vast resources, it needed people who could cultivate this land for them. The indigenous people in the area, the Red Indians, were considered too feeble or weak to be able to fit into this economic equation of the Europeans, and they looked towards Africa. So the pattern of relations between Europe and Africa became restructured or reconfigured, all right, other than the initial exchanges of commodities into the exchanges of humans, as a commodity. So in Europe, we noted that the possession of colonies, which started also around the 15th centuries, when, for instance, the Pope. Sorry, are we together? Can you hear me? I need to be sure that
Yes,
uh,
sir.
we are on the
Yes,
same
sir.
page
Yes,
at
sir.
all the time. Right.
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
great. So what I'm trying to say is that it was from 15th century, perhaps when the acquisition, the jostling for territories and influence following the voyage of exploration, right, between Portugal and Spain, led to the discoveries of some of these areas, all right, in Africa. For instance, it was in a bid, as we've mentioned, for the Europeans to explore the island in the Far East, where they obtained food, that led to this voyage of exploration. So in the first instance, the slaves did not disrupt the European social structure. That is the first point we're trying to make. All right. So rather, they made it possible for these nations to
I
develop
don't
their.
know what I've she told you guys to be writing attendance.
Hello, can you mute yourself? Who is that? I said in Europe, the possession of colonies, which started around the 15th century when the Pope bestowed sovereignty on all countries, discovered between the Cape Abojado and East Indies on Portugal, on the areas towards the west on Spain, conferred importance on slaves. So this marks an important episode in the development of trade. In the first instance, as I've mentioned, slaves did not disrupt the European social structure. Rather, they made it possible for these nations to develop their colonial possessions. Portugal, for instance, in this case, was the first to realize the usefulness of slaves on our colonial possessions. Right? In fact, slaves and gold dust were the first articles of trade which the Portuguese would traders took from the coast of West Africa. All right. So initially, as I've mentioned, they were not much of many of them were probably interested in uh, this nefarious enterprise. So they were initially exchanging other commodities and stuff, from West Africa until the economic necessity, changed. So Portugal was the first to realize that they needed slaves to explore this vast arable land in the New World. So African slaves were considered, especially by Prince Henry, to be very useful to the Portuguese, since they could help to develop their internal resources and colonial possessions in the West Indies. Right. So in order to win people to their side also, the merchants started the propagation of darkest Etinism. Do you know what that means? I believe you all know what the idea of dark Etinism is all about. At least in some of your African history class, you must have been taught, how African was denigrated and how Africans were portrayed in European philosophical construction. So Africans were seen as people who probably were barbaric. So Africa, the claim, was full of Athenians and cannibals. And it was on this basis that they were able to justify the transportation of Africans to different soils as part of their act of humanity, right? To probably to civilize some of these people. So consequently, on a large scale and without limitations, Britain, France, and Holland joined Portugal and Spain, conferring rights and immunities on companies to import slaves into their different countries, and especially their colonial possessions in America, in the West Indies, that is in South America, Latin America, the Jamaica, and all the areas that had been discovered by these various Europeans. And it was the slaves were supposed to help in the production activities, especially the sugarcane plantations, the tobacco plantations, and other agricultural plantations which developed massively in various parts of the Americas. When I mean the Americas, I'm talking about the North America, what is now known as the United States, and the South America. That is all of the Latin America, the South America, Latin America. That is Cuba, Brazil, Portugal. All right, Brazil. All right, okay, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and all this Colombia and all these areas. So by the 15th century, when the idea of slavery, especially the idea of converting the surplus land in America for plantation agriculture, especially the with the population of the America, which was considered very tiny, and that the indigenous people were not accustomed to the intensive labor needed by the Europeans for the plantation system. So, of course, it became rational for Africa to be the major supplier of of this nefarious enterprise, commodity. So once Spaniards realized that they would have to supplement the American resources of labor, for instance, they turned to West Africa particularly for a steady supply of slaves. Right? Are we still together, please? So let me know in case I lose the connection.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right. So it was through this process that Africa became the major supplier. Male and female slaves were captured. Able-bodied men, not male and female, able-bodied men were captured and converted. All right. They were wired into slaves. They were captured and purchased for use as agricultural laborers, as servants, in most cases as artisans, and in smaller numbers as soldiers and officials. So most of these slaves were the bulk of these slaves were taken to the New World. When I mean the New World, when I talk about the New World, I mean America, the Americas, both South and North America. Of course, some slaves were also taken to Europe, various parts of Europe, where they were used for various all kinds of nefarious activities. So this obnoxious trade would affect this, put the social foundation of African development, which we had examined in the previous class. The Spaniards, for instance, believed that the Negroes, that is the Africans, the blacks, were very strong and had the experience for a tedious and sustained agriculture in the tropics, for instance. So in about 1530s, the transatlantic slave trade began, and this meant the transportation of African people by Europeans across the Atlantic for sales in America. No, this was a kind of trade. All right, the way you go to Yaba, for instance, to buy commodities, your clothing materials, when they place them on the floor and you select. This was apparently how Africans, all right, were reduced, were molested, were harassed, were dehumanized and placed for people, merchants, to come and price, examining the various parts of their bodies, all right, as a negotiating mechanisms, determining their prices. All right, so you would be able to see, as I speak, you should be able to decipher what the impact of all of this would mean for the social dignity, for economic development, for social transformation and political organization in Africa. So it should be noted that the nature and the scale of this trade in the 15th and 16th century were very different from what the later became from the 17th and 18th century. So that is what I've explained so far is only a child's play compared to the transformation of this obnoxious enterprise. The number of slaves imported into America, for instance, was strictly regulated by the Spanish authorities. And since Spain herself possessed no trading base in West Africa, for instance, the trade was done by means of contracts. All right, that is asientos in Spanish language, which was granted by Spanish government, who were either Portuguese themselves or who had Portuguese agents. So it was with the exception, with only few cases, such as the slaving voyages of the English John Hawkins, all right, between 1562 and 1568, the supply of slaves to the European colonies, especially in North America in the 16th century, was entirely dominated by the Portuguese. So don't forget that we mentioned that the two critical countries that pioneered the obnoxious slave trade were the Spanish and the Portuguese. So they were perhaps the ones who inaugurated the stores before other Europeans came in to join, the British came in to join, and the French will come, the other European, the Dutch particularly, also became highly influential in this evil business. So the capacity of the Portuguese to carry slaves across the Atlantic was what gave it the kind of momentum, all right, that made it the prominent. Because don't forget that in your earlier history courses, the voyage of exploration was orchestrated by the Portuguese and the Spanish. They were the ones who that revolution, that maritime revolution, was started. They started in Spain and Portugal through their heavy investments in navigation, learning, science, astronomy, geography, shipbuilding, and so on and so forth. So they were the first European, the Portuguese were perhaps the first European to build sophisticated ships that could sail or travel across the Atlantic. All right, so the capacity of the Portuguese to carry slaves across the Atlantic was undoubtedly due to the shipping resources available and the relatively low demand, all right, or interest of the other Europeans at the beginning. So the mines subsequently, as in mines needed new laborers, and the plantations of the Spanish in America and the Portuguese in Brazil, for instance, in the 16th century started needing more. So much Europeans started joining, and for instance, it was noted that between this early period that I've mentioned, about 125,000 all right, was shipped to the Portuguese colonies in the South America, while the Spanish colonies also had about 75,000, all right, in its own colonies. And this was quite low at the beginning. If you see this number to what I'm going to be explaining later, this is quite low compared to what was supplied to the island of Sao Tome subsequently, all right, which absorbed about 60,000 African slaves during the same period. So the point I'm making is that development of plantations in the Americas, pardon me, especially by the Portuguese in Brazil, was considerably stepped up by the third decades of the 17th century. All right, but even so, the first 100 years of the transatlantic slave trade particularly saw more than 200,000 Africans landing in the Americas again. So, and the majorities of these people, these slaves, were carried across Atlantic, the Atlantic during the late 17th and 18th centuries, all right, at the peak of the slave trade. So you could imagine we would probably find time to talk about the radioactive effects of this trauma, all right, of this shock, all right, nostalgia, all right, on Africa, on African people. As I would always ask you to read. How many of you have even watched the documentary Roots, which I asked you to go and read? I believe some of you have watched Roots. So if you have watched Roots, the documentary, you would have a kind of broad understanding or a faint idea of what this trade, what it connoted, what transpired, and how African. So many of the slaves, died in the journey between Africa to America. All right, many of them who refused to be dehumanized, to be abused, they refused to be exported. Most of them were leaders shot, all right, on their journey to across the Atlantic. Many, all right, deliberately jumped into the Atlantic. They decided to die and take their life in the Atlantic than to be taken to America or Europe as slaves. There were quite a number of those who were dehumanized, women raped, both on the journey and also in their respective domains in the slave world. And this would, you begin to, as you read also and listen, you'll be able to decipher some of the more diverse. Of course, you need to read D.P. Manis, the slave cargo, right, where he narrated how Africans were packed, as fish in the sardine plate under the cabin of the ships, all right, and this would also be enriched when you see some documentary evidence. So the majority of the slaves who were carried across the Atlantic during the 19th century, were dehumanized. They were molested, and by the time the competition in the slave trade among Europeans even increased, in the 17th century, it was more fierce, right? So the demand for slaves always exceeded the supply. The demand for slaves, that means much of what was taken from Africa was not even enough to take care of the need of the Europeans. So it was a vibrant, it was a very lucrative, it was a ballooning, and it was a booming and blossoming enterprise. A situation that was clearly favorable to the English merchant who assumed the role of buying and selling them to French and to Spanish planters or plantation owners, as well as their own colonists, basically. So as a result of this competition led by the English, don't forget that by after the 16th century, let me put it mildly, the English had come to monopolize this trade network in slaves. The Portuguese and the Spanish who initiated this, all right, have been stepped aside, not stepped aside, they were still involved, but stronger European power had emerged, like Britain, France, and the Dutch, all right, who perhaps dominated this pernicious, this obnoxious trade. All right. So each of these European powers that I've mentioned commissioned their own companies, as I'm going to demonstrate, slave company, all right, buying companies, merchant firms, and other smaller entities which organize or operated or purchased slaves from Africa. Sweden, Denmark, Brandenburg also began to engage in this business of buying slaves in West Africa and selling them to European planters in West Indies and America. So unlike England and France, these countries were not great colonial powers possessing important plantations, all right, in America. These lesser competitors in the slave trade also did not operate in the same way as England and France. However, they were able to secure most of their clients by observing the Danish, the Brandenburger slave-in company. So they saw the way in which the English and the Dutch and the Scandinavian countries which organized this business did, and were able to also get involved. So it was all kind of there's a proverb on the death of an elephant, all right, you see all kind of knives and cutlasses emerge. So on the death of African civilization, all kinds of powers came into Africa, molesting and abusing and torturing, dehumanizing the people and the polity. Also, there are also other newcomers, all right, apart from all kinds of Europeans who came to dominate the trade. So very significant in the 17th century was the role played by European merchants, especially the Liverpoolians, Liverpool, all right, and other from North West England who took on the slave factorage and other activities in the West Indies on behalf of the Liverpool clients, often acting as agents. So this was a very organized, it was a very sophisticated network. It was a very organized trade system, commercial system, where people, organizations, companies were formed, all right, not just to import rice and beans. These were monopolies, strong monopolies, which were established basically these were strong monopolies established to buy slaves from Africa, to trade in Africa. So for most of you, for instance, who are fans of the Manchester United club, Liverpool United club, do you understand? You need to be properly educated. The labor and the ingenuity of Africans, the blood of Africans who were taken into slavery for 400 years was a constitutive element of the process that led to the capital formation that is used to propel, to drive this football team that you are a major supporter. I'm not trying to discourage anybody, all right? The resources embedded that the player is earning so much today, the wealth derived from this pernicious enterprise was what went into this. So it was divested into several other stuff. All right. The transatlantic slave trade was the root of the industrialization and modernity in Europe. All right. From the 19th century and beyond. We'll come to that later. Right. So I think subsequently I'll show you some of the prices, the amount in which slaves were acquired in Africa. So, but what is important, as I've mentioned, is that the first English company in Africa, the Royal Adventure Trading company was chartered in 1660, and in 1672, it was succeeded by the Royal African Company. Right, the first French company was a French company, the French West Indies Company, chartered around 1664. And it should also be mentioned, however, that there had been earlier English companies with a monopoly of English trade to West Africa, which were chartered from 1588, 1618, and also around 1631. And just as there had been 4 companies with monopoly of French trade in West Africa as far as 1634 and 1658. So this will tell you that this was not just a kind of economic activity, it was a monopoly. So, but nonetheless, none of these earlier English and French West African companies had been a lasting success, and none of them was as strong as the English company of the 1660s and 1670s. And the French also had very, very solid, organized firms. The Liverpool also registered several ships that entered the slave trade from around the 1690s, but they were regularly involved in it only after 1713. And even then, Liverpool's share of the British slave trade remained modest, all right, compared to that of London, Bristol, Manchester, all right, whose merchants successively dominated the British trade until the 1730s. And it was only after the 1740s did Liverpool begin to assume supremacy in British slave trading and ultimately eclipse other British and indeed European parts as a slave trading company. Okay, so you'll be able to see from all of this discussion the level of opprobrium, right? The level of opprobrium that actually shaped these economic activities before it was abolished after over 400 years. And I think the person that captured it most succinctly is Akinpelu Olutayo, a professor of sociology at the University of Ibadan, who noted that England had become the chief actor in the slave traffic by the 17th and 18th centuries. And this was possible because of our naval power over all other nations. And in fact, an English company, for instance, the fact that an English company, the Royal Niger Company, was supplying Spanish colonies with slaves under contract for several hundreds of years will show you the enormity of wealth, the surplus accrued from this slave trade to the Europeans, to the British particularly. And these companies were free to import as many slaves as it could dispose of. The company also further to agree to pay the King of Spain 3,000 crowns and 33.5 crowns on every slave imported into his dominion. This could tell you how much of this lasted. And in addition, there were these companies were required to pay the King of Spain and England each a quarter share of all their profit. So you could imagine how much. I think you can see a slide on the slide there. I'm still going to show you more slides. So in spite of these measures, the company saw the deal as still profitable. In spite of sharing a huge chunk, the bulk of their proceed, with the kings, all right, they still made. I've told you how after the abolition in the 19th century, many of these firms, companies, reinvested this wealth into several enterprises. Few of such are the football company, and these are microcosm, just little of the companies that they use all of this world for. If Manchester United company could have so much resources, all right, to run the gaming activities, if Man United, the Liverpool Football Club could do so, several others, you could imagine then how much each European countries or firms realize from this slave trade. So in spite of this, these economic activities continue. So individual merchants were not allowed to trade to West Africa, all right, unless they were members of or licensed as a recognized national company. So the slave trade, no country, and that is why our quest for reparation, right, is quite justified. The fact that we've continued, I'm a member of several decolonial movements advocating for the recompense for reparation to Africa. All right, this is the basis. No individual country can extricate itself from the evils committed between 15th century and the 19th century. All last week, from Thursday, Friday, I was immersed in the Bodleian archives in Oxford. The earlier last upper week, I was in the Kew Gardens in London, where I was using the British archives. You needed to see, in most cases, I would have to pause, while viewing some of these archival records to see what was done to Africans, to your great-great-grandfather and the great-grandfather that birthed your grandfather and my father. You would want to read the way Africans were treated. So no European countries would want to extricate itself, because the slave trade was not carried out by individual merchants. All of these were registered companies, were licensed companies by their various countries, all right, which paid royalties back to their host countries. All right. So trade was officially limited to the monopoly companies, because only large and powerful companies, for instance, in this case, could afford to build, to maintain, and garrison the forts on the coast of West Africa, which were deemed essential in the 17th century for the conduct of the slave trade. So the European slave traders secured their slaves by buying them on the coast from African merchants who had obtained or bought them from the interior. And since it was difficult that slave and ships both arrive on the coast at a steady rate, so depots of some kind of fort, all right, where slave house had to be built, to stock slaves, all right, for the number of days that the ships would come to empty them, to the journey. And this was a very organized. So in the 17th century, these slaves depots also needed to be fortified and also garrisoned. All right, you know what it means to be garrisoned, to be protected in order to defend them against attacks by armed forces of a rival slave company. Because one key thing, that is why you have to watch the Roots. You need to watch Roots documentary, as I've mentioned. So there were even quarrels. There were also counter raidings among the various European powers. Some European powers who had more sophisticated ammunitions will come to raid the warehouse, let me put it that way, of another company to steal bulk of slaves, all right, and sell them off the Atlantic. It was a very devastating and catastrophic episode in the history of Africa, particularly in terms of social and economic dimension, all right, of it. So it can be mentioned that throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, a large number of European forts and trade posts were established on the shores of Africa, West Africa particularly, and their ownership was constantly changing as the slave trading nations fought one another to enlarge their trade in slaves. By the 18th century, many of these African kingdoms, empires, and states, Oyo, Benin, Dahomey, all right, Ashanti, Ifanti, the Mandinka, all right, states, all of these, all right, became increasingly involved with the Europeans in the coast. All right, at the beginning I told you that the only category of people left behind by the Europeans were perhaps the African chiefs, the elites, all right, the kings and their rulers, the warriors, the warlords, who either for the fear of their lives, but the need to worship the gods of their belly, will have to collaborate with the Europeans in capturing and selling their own brethren. All right. So these were people, it was an organized crime. The Europeans would come and dump heavy artillery guns, all right, at the disposal of the African chiefs, all right, with gin. All right. Last week at the archive, when I said that, I almost stopped, I paused at the point and I was almost weeping. I saw an archival record where in the 1770s, late 1770s, Aláàfin Abíọ́dún in Ọ̀yọ́ would sold 120 slaves, Yoruba people, for 3 umbrellas and some assorted gin. These were the stuff that were used. I'll show you other means of payment of slaves, all right, subsequently. But a king was corrupted, right? And he sold 120 Yoruba people that were raided and abducted for 3 big umbrellas and some bottles of gins, shinap. That is to tell you the level of. So in another topic, although we are still going to look at the collaboration, African involvement in this slave trade, all right, but what I'm trying to say is that, so Africans became highly involved by the 18th century, all right, with Europeans on the coast to the south, and they were the major suppliers of these slaves for the transatlantic trade. So these competing firms, European firms, also stationed in Africa, such as the Liverpool traders, they also started giving credit, all right, to African dealers based on trust, or more specifically on their belief that those whom they gave credit will fulfill their contract to supply slaves. So once a ship is traveling, taking slaves, before its return, he would have given some money, advance credit, to these African chiefs and warriors, all right, for the next supply of slaves. So it was not a matter of coming and waiting for the slaves to be supplied. On the arrival, as the Europeans were arriving, most of the slaves would have been kept in the fort, in the warehouse, if you like, waiting for the shipment. This is quite an highly dehumanizing, particularly, all right. So, and this system paved the way for an increase in the supply of slaves to the coast. The African chiefs and rulers involved now had the requisite resources, the machineries to embark on these slave raiding expeditions. And by the time the Liverpool Company assumed supremacy in British slave trading in the 1740s, this nefarious enterprise had almost reached a crescendo. All right. Do you know what crescendo is? For those of you who play music, it has reached the peak, the pinnacle, the zenith, or the apogee, if you like, as one of my teachers used to say. All right, so you could see the figure, the number on your screen. All right, the slave export from Africa, on the from Atlantic Africa to Americas by region. Look at the from Syria, from Senegambia by 1701 alone, it was 51,918. The following decade or so, 1726 to 1750, it had moved to 98,000. By 1751, it was 132,077. All right, and by the end of that, almost by the end of that century, by 1810, for instance, only Senegambia supplied 377,515, all right, slaves. Sierra Leone, beginning from 1701, had supplied 9,336, and by the end of by 1810, it has increased to 226,833. And look at the figure like that, and this will tell you the nature, right, of this obnoxious slave trade and the dynamics of it, or particularly among Africa. So the 18th century particularly saw an increase in the export of human beings from Sierra Leone, and the Windward Coast as a result of the massive influx of resident Europeans and all of this. In fact, the 18th century was the height of this slave trade, particularly in this figure particularly presented, revealed that among the African slaves, all right, among the 7 slave supplier of this slave trade into Africa, all right, the major polities that supply the most are perhaps the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, all right, which is now known as the Slave Coast, all right. The West Central Africa also supplied a huge, all right. So the Bight of Benin, that covers the area of Badagry, Lagos, the Niger Delta, all right. All of these played a pivotal role in the the transformation of this. So the sites of major activities in the Gold Coast were the Cape Coast and Elmina. In the Bight of Benin, it was Ouida, West Africa, and it was also at Luanda, south of the Congo. And all of these areas were very important to the Europeans. They had their massive slave ports, all right, companies, built structures, all right, which they stayed, they lived, married African women, molested enough, and still sold them across the Atlantic. All right. So, and West Africa, south of the Congo, also trade in West. They also had a huge contribution to all of these activities during this period. So it also bears noting that in every region where the slave trade business occurred, the supply of captives for sale to European carriers remained essentially under African control. That is also important because we cannot extricate the African elites. The problem of elitism in Africa, in post-colonial Africa, can be traced back to the 15th and 16th century and 17th century. All right. So they played it because by this period, the Europeans had not been able to penetrate into the interior of Africa, West Africa. What they did was to provide the resources, the funds, the whiskey, the umbrella, the guns, the gunpowder, the boats, right, and money. And these African elites, sent their warriors into the interior hinterland to raid and abduct their own kinsmen. All right, so I will look at in a short moment now, go into some of the real prices of slaves. But before that, as I was trying to say that, so there are quite a number of factors, all right, that explain the changing contribution of different regions to the growth of the slave trade. They included the population density of each environment. There was also the political structure and warfare, or the nature of warfare, the environment, and even the religious conflicts in most areas, especially in the Western Sudan, particularly what you know as the Savannah part, all right, from Mali to Burkina Faso, modern day, to Chad, all right, to Niger, to Nigeria, modern day Nigeria, okay, the Gambia, Sierra Leone, religious issues, especially issues related to Islamic fundamentalism, the jihads, all right, contributed immensely to the uh, growth of the transatlantic slave trade. So as more people were invaded, all right, more people were captured, and some of these captured people were not used for domestic agriculture or indentured slaves, all right, as indentured slaves. Most of these people were whisked, were transported, were sold to the Europeans, and these were the major sources of the supply. So the 18th century saw an increase in the export of human beings from Sierra Leone and the Windward Coast as a result of the massive influx of Europeans who probably lived among and in some areas intermarried with local traders. You could see the level of duplicity, the level of opaqueness of the Europeans, right, who were involved in this, in trying to corrupt people, intermarrying people who would, in the process, give crucial informations about the geography, about the movement of people, and all of this. So most of these Africans, started working as intermediaries in trade relations with these Europeans, and it's quite pathetic. So the Liverpool trade in slaves boomed again during the 18th century, as its traders were willing to broker trade with other regions, notably the Bight of Benin or Bight of Biafra, all right, in the Niger Delta of Nigeria, the Luango coast of West Africa, and also south of East Africa. All of these. So this slave dealing with the Bight of Biafra, West Central Africa, Sierra Leone, and the Windward Coast were also very pivotal to the growth of the Liverpool slave trade between 1725 and 1807. And in all of these regions, direct dealings with the merchants by shipmasters was key feature of commercial operation. The Liverpool slave trading in West Africa, for instance, north of the Congo River in the second quarter of the 18th century, increased demonstrably, and then after a slide in the following 40 years, there was a resurgence in export from the region in the final decade of the British slave trade, all right, until 1807 when the slave trade was abolished. And the slippage in Liverpool trade with West Africa in the middle of the 18th century reflected increased competition, all right, for slaves in the region, in Africa, in West Africa particularly, among the French and the Dutch and the English people. So it was this competition that propelled different European trading firms to renew their working relationship with African merchants. Well, most of them started, uh, corrupting African elite the more, enticing, right? That's the word, enticing them, right, to be a major player, to monopolize the trade, all right, the trade in the supply of slaves. And there also existed a strong bond of trust between African rulers who supplied slaves from the interior to European slaves. So you could see that most of the African rulers who are not the coast, they were not neutral, because there is a tendency for us to assume that most of the rulers in the coast were the major conspirator, all right, were the major architect of the slaves, that the ones in the interior were just the victims. No, there are indications, based on my own archival research, there are indications now that most of these African rulers in the interior had an understanding with their counterparts at the coast, all right, and as they raided, as they prosecuted anarchy in their domain, they supplied their counterparts in the coast with these slaves and get their own return. So it was an organized, so that is why most often I always tell students, when we read Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, right, which is a very, very solid account of the transatlantic slave trade, it is also germane, it is also important that we read works of Claude Ake and other scholars about how Africans also develop, how Africans also underdevelop Africa. Because without the involvement, as we're going to see perhaps in the next topic, without the involvement of African elites, the transatlantic slave trade would have been less meaningfully impactful. It would have died a natural death, and we're going to see much of that in the next class when we look at. So slave prices in Africa between the 17th and 19th century were also expressed. Okay, before that, I've mentioned that there were different forms of exchanges, the means through which the Europeans paid for some of the slaves. All right, they were in most cases paid through foreign goods and other required instruments. All right, to indigenous traders, especially commodities. There were mundane materials that were given to Africa: umbrella, shoes, mirror, gun and gunpowder, perhaps clothes, and all the other stuff. So slave prices were expressed in pound sterling, particularly also, and dollars, and occasionally in local units of account, maybe probably cowries, right? Cowries and gold in most cases, but they use also the corrupted African elite with pound sterlings, with dollars, and their indigenous various modes of exchanges. So one major development at the end of the 18th century, when Britain began to abolish the slave trade, was the increase in price of slaves in Africa, because with the abolition of the slave trade by the Europeans, was quite acute shortage, right, of slaves during this period, and this actually reflected in the prices of the commodity. Yeah, I'm using the word commodity, for instance, to explain all of this. So the price started varying from one location to the other. Before the abolition of the slave trade, the prices of slaves were largely determined by demand conditions in the Americas, rather than prices stagnating after the official abolition of the slave trade in the early 19th century. So with a few exceptions, and in some areas such as St. Louis and God in Senegambia, where minimal prices of slaves fell apparently, in the 1810 and 1820s. In other places such as Luanda, the chief port, especially in Angola, slaves prices fluctuated between 15 pounds to 18 pounds per slaves across. In most cases, it rose to over 30 pounds around the 1830s. And in the Gold Coast, where prices fell in the 1810s, slave prices appeared to have risen strongly after about 1820 and 1830, reaching levels very similar to those before 1807. All right. So I'm trying to show you the prices before I round up, the prices for the commodity. Okay, can you see this slide? Can you see my slide?
Not really. It's kind of
Okay. Okay, I'll try to read out some of the prices if it's quite too blurred for you to see, shortly. So the prices varied from the different categories of slaves and different physiographic configuration, right? The gender also, the age, the ability of the slaves also. So differences in prices were also based on gender, age, and the location of slaves, whether male or female, where they were taken, because it was believed that some parts of Africa were quite much stronger than other places, other parts. In some cases, religion also determined the prices of slaves, especially the Muslim captives in areas like Jenne and Timbuktu on the upper reaches of the Niger River. The outer cities, Borno, and also Yoruba land, and various towns along the Niger Delta near its confluence with the Benue were also prized highly, because they felt that these people are quite much strong, right? So in some areas in West Africa, especially the West Interior, as well as Central and the Central Sudan, the prices also varied in regional markets according to the level of demand, which so Paul Lovejoy, for instance, stated that about 124,000 slaves were exported from exported south from the Central Sudan to the Atlantic, between 1805 and 1850 alone. All right, and approximately 95% of these slaves were prime male, young people in their prime. All right, and out of these 986,000 were shipped from West Africa to the America. Right, as to the volume of slaves, right, which were taken from Africa, it remains a subject of debate amongst why several scholars, Eurocentric scholars like Philip Cotton, for instance, had noted that, well, the number of slaves taken from Africa cannot be more than 11 million between 15th century and the 19th century. Other Afrocentric scholars, especially notably Professor Joseph Inikori, who retired from the Ahmadu Bello University, all right, had noted, who used almost a similar instrument, mathematical instrument of calculation, to say that the number that was quoted by Philip Cotton, 11 million, was perhaps the number taken within a particular century, decades. And so, not that could not have accounted for the entire number, volume of slaves taken for 400 years, 11 million. That perhaps 11 million was less, to be modest, was something taken within a century. But he even also felt that this is just something that was taken within some decades. All right. And so this will tell you, when you are trying to analyze the impact of the slave trade, it will tell you, to show you how much some of these. So the prices of slaves vary from one region to another. That's what I was saying. For example, a female slave in Hausa land in the 1770 cost 15 ducats, all right, which was equivalent to about 36,000 cowries. And while it was also it was about 50 ducats for a strong male. That 50 ducat is for strong male. In the Western Sudan, the price of female slaves was about 72,000 cowries, in the 1770s. And at Sinsani, a slave woman cost 80,000, between 80,000 to 100,000 cowries, and a man, cost about 40,000 cowries, and a girl, also a young girl, fine girl, about 40,000 cowries. So this latter figure is quite equivalent to $20 US dollar for men, and 40 to 50 US dollar for women. So a strong and handsome man in Timbuktu, for instance, in 1821 was about the value of $30. A very strong and handsome man. Like, who is handsome in your class? Who is the most handsome guy in your class?
No one.
No one. Okay, unfortunate. All right. So a strong and handsome man in the in the 17th century was sold for about $50. How much is $50 now? Maybe about 75,000 or so, or 80,000 naira. So that is the price for a very handsome man. All right, and a young female, all right, was about $25. All right, someone like Baraka, or who is the person in that class? Whose name did I know in that class again? No, maybe like Jessica, or who again did I know again? What was that girl that used to cause trouble in the class? All right, that's just a joke anyway. All right, so I'm just giving that this to show the nefarious impact of all of this. If humans were priced at a very ridiculous amount, it tells you the impact that this would have, all right, not on the conscience. All right, I told you that the transatlantic slave trade was the hypnotism, the wiring that continues to reconfigure African people, African elite, to function in a dysfunctional manner that they are doing. The fact that, look at recently when the UK did the survey, a survey about Africans who have houses. In the UK now, where I live in Botley Road in Oxford, there are quite a number of estate houses that are locked up. Most of these houses are not probably inhabited. And a empirical investigation suggests that most of these houses are owned by Africans. Do you understand? Look at a prominent banker who died, in Nigeria recently. I don't want to mention the name. With a recent investigation by the UK government, that over 100 mansions in the UK are traceable to this person. All right. So should we start investigating what each political elite had stolen and stored in different parts of Europe? And this is quite pathetic to note. For instance, when you see the enormity of wealth, stolen wealth from Africa, all right, and you can trace all of these avarice, this greed, this lack of loyalty, lack of patriotism, zero statesmanship, duplicity, bribery, corruption, deceit, dishonesty, primitive accumulation, lack of national ideology, betrayal, and all of this perfidy, opaqueness, opacity to the 15th century. The ways in which the Europeans corrupted a typical African elite to sell their handsome men for $50. In Tripoli, a female slave was priced for from between $80 to $90, and so that you could see the amount, the varying, situation in different parts. At Ida, a young female would fetch, for instance, from 60 to 120,000 cowries. And these were several prices. There were several prices around the Niger-Benue confluence and the lower Benue. For instance, in 1831, at Rabat, for instance, the then capital of the Nupe, the price of a strong LD lad was about 40,000 cowries, which is just about 8 sterling. A girl fetched as much as 50,000, all right, cowries. And this is the situation. In the Niger Delta, a strong, well-grown young man was worth about just 30 to 50,000 cowries, which is about $15 to $25 in today. $15, which is the amount I used to go and drink beer, in the down street of Oxford around Cowley yesterday night, right? I even spent more than that. So this will tell you, a boy, a small boy costs lesser than that. Among the Tuareg and Kassina merchants, a grown man with beard will cost between 10,000 to 15,000 cowries, and an older woman, all right, is about between 10,000 to 15,000 cowries, all right. And these are some of this thing in Yoruba land endowment. There's no difference, and let me now even show you the most complex aspect. The pricing of people based on can you see this slide more better? Can you relate to this slide more better? Can you see this much more clearly? Hello?
Yes, sir, we can.
Yes, sir, we can see it.
So you could see the young, a youth with beard beginning from 30,000 and under. Generally, boy without beard, 30 to 35,000 cowries. Small boy, 20,000. Older women, 10,000. Women with breast hanging down, that's the older women, 80,000 and under. Right? Women with plump breasts, those ones are very, very agile because they will be able to sleep with them and be able to use them. All right, 100,000 and under. Girls with little breasts, all of these, smaller girls, female, and these are some of the, very ridiculous, pricing of humans. Unfortunately, to just make you weary. One would think that after the abolition of slave trade in 1807 and 1830s, that everything about slavery has come to an end. Oh, I was rigged, I was perplexed, I was bewildered last week as I was immersed in the Bodleian archive, and I started immersing data. Even as we speak in contemporary period, slavery is still an integral part of the social division or international division of labor. There are many Africans who are still being sold to slavery through the Sahara, to get to Europe, through Libya, through Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, getting to Italy, getting to Spain, getting to Portugal. just to come to Europe. Ridiculous. There are within Africa, the global chocolate industry is sustained by child slavery in Côte d'Ivoire, in Sao Tome, formerly Fernando Po. These are very ridiculous. When I engage with all of this data as an ethnographer, as an anthropologist, I'm so sick. Just yesterday, I was mining the data on Ivory Coast, the volume of child slavery. Children will be kidnapped maybe in Sao Tome or in Rwanda, and they will be smuggled, all right, across border to go to Ivory Coast with under gun pressure, at gunpoint supervision. They are coerced to work as slaves in the cocoa plantation. Oh, in Italy, in France, what is wrong with the Black people? Is anything tragically or transcendentally wrong with the Black people? So I'll try to summarize because I think I need to take some water. So you can see the prices also vary based on gender, all right, and in several places, in the middle Niger, as I've read, you see the variation and all the stuff. So it is important to note that, as this data has shown, the slave acquisition during the transatlantic slave trade was not a matter of external forces, invading another group, or either a Yoruba enslaving another Bariba, Hausa, Kanuri. Capturing one another was actually something conducted by the elite. It was a transaction among the ruling elites, who perhaps was enticed or corrupted by the Europeans. Although people spoke mutually intelligible dialect, shared many cultural traits, and had a nostalgic attachment to an ancestor, it was common for people of the same ethnic, such as Oyo, Ife, Ekiti, Ondo, among others, to capture and sell their members to another people. And people of the same kinship kidnapped their relations and sold them into slavery. The disorderliness, disorderly thinking, all right, and uncertainty of daily life cheapened the value of kinship and collectivism that shaped the pre-colonial African society. And it is important for us to, in a way, understand how this actually shaped development in Africa. If you have any question, please ask before I raise the last comment. Have you all written the attendance? Have you all written the attendance? Okay, there's a question, Stephen Benga. All right. All right.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah, good morning. Here,
Sir, please, I need your contribution to this question. So, would you say the slave trade? Would you say the slave trade was? Would you agree with me that the slave trade was not a profitable venture because the nature of the slave trade was not cost effective?
to
I
the
didn't get my
Africans or
question.
to the Europeans? You mean to the Africans?
No, to the Europeans, sir.
It was an highly egregiously profitable venture for the Europeans and the African elite who collaborated with them. I mentioned that as I'm going to mention that when I'm talking about the impact, the transatlantic slave trade was the root of the industrialization and modernity that Europe goes. I'm at Oxford now. If you want me to look after this class, I will share some of the magnificent structures in Oxford for you. These are structures that were built about 700 years ago. If you see what was built from the labor, from the wealth derived from slavery 700 years ago, they are still standing. They are still standing. It was an highly rewarding profitable venture, not only for the African, parasitic, deranged elite, but for also the Europeans who are also deranged, who are evil. All right, have I answered your question, please?
Yes, sir.
The second part is it was not cost effective. If I told you how they shared 1/5, 1/3 of the profits they made with their kings and their various rulers. You then now begin to think how much did the company themselves realize that, okay, maybe during when I'm teaching the impact, I will tell you how each of these companies divested their profits. You probably asking me this question, you are a fan of the Manchester Football Club, or you are a fan of the Liverpool. If you do, you need to go and do a rethink. You perhaps belong to a Pentecostal church who on Sunday on weekly basis like MFM, you bind your African ancestor. You bind your ancestor in the name of Jesus. The white man who committed this atrocity would never bind and cast his ancestor. His own ancestor justify this atrocity committed against African humanity. Let's ask your next question.
Okay, so will you say that the barbaric nature of Africans also contributed to the transatlantic slave trade, because it was like a transactional something between the Africans and the Europeans. So I believe that because of the greedy nature and the barbaric nature of Africans made that transaction to be possible. Because if
what do you mean by
Africans,
barbaric? What do you mean by barbaric? You say greedy. I say I will even contextualize you. What do you mean by barbaric? You mean Africans were barbaric at that time?
Yes, sir. Because how will you sell your fellow Africans?
Okay. Were you in the last class? Were you in my last class? The one we treated Africa before this transatlantic slavery? Did you attend?
Yes, sir.
Okay, you need to go back to the slide on YouTube. I will say that. So we've established that Africa was not barbaric at the time they encountered the Europeans. You see from the various kingdoms, the political institutions, they were not barbaric. All right. So in terms of the greed, I've mentioned from the beginning, from the first class, that the transatlantic slave trade was a critical factor in the disorderly thinking, disorderly functioning of the African society. It was the transatlantic slave trade that became the wiring, the hypnotism that shaped the mind of the great ancestor, that shaped the great-grand ancestor, that influenced the mind of the great-grandfather, that influenced the great-grandfather, that influenced your grandfather and my grandfather. So it was at that time that the perversion of African social values was perpetuated. That is the point. So scholars have established that even before the 14th century, Africa was much more developed than Europe. That's another, at an advanced level, maybe at the master's level, you can be taught that. So the issue of primitivity or barbarism doesn't come to play before the 15th century. The greed itself doesn't come, because the issue of corruption, it was the elite that the Europeans corrupted. Don't forget that the Europeans did not have access to the ordinary people. It is the elite they gave the wine, the umbrellas, the guns, and the gunpowder, all right, the ammunitions in which they used to prosecute anarchy. Did they give the ordinary people, the palm wine tapper, the farmer? No. You need to contextualize. So if you write that perspective for me in the exam, I'm going to fail you. All right. All right. Thank you. All right. Is there any question, Baraka? All right. So I observed that the last video I posted on the YouTube, none of you have gone to dissect it. Yeah, I will not say that what I'm going to say is that you will not stop learning. You complain that your exam, Dr.